Dr. Claudine Lee, very welcome to the show. So Dr. Lee, you're a GP and you've got quite a few different hats that you've worn over the years. One of the main topics we're chatting about today is about diabetes and about your history and your experience, where you are now and where you're headed into the future, and what you think where this country and the healthcare system and potentially diabetes is going.
Thank you, and thanks for this opportunity. My name's Claudine and I am a GP in Hilton, KZN. I consider myself very lucky to live in a very beautiful part of the world, and I do actually consider myself very lucky to live in South Africa. As many challenges as we have, I think we have many opportunities, and I think we have beautiful people, which is a resource that is huge. I never thought I'd be in private practice. I did a lot of work in government after qualifying, doing various different diplomas and working in various different fields of medicine, but I did find myself in GP-dom, and very shortly after getting into the GP world, I did a diploma in diabetes. I had a wonderful mentor who kind of guided me in that direction, and I'm ever grateful because I find it exciting and a privilege to actually work with people who have a disease that can be very tricky to manage, and it requires quite a lot of different skills, I think, and definitely to be managed within a team. Yeah, so I do a wide range of practice, but probably at least 50 to 60% of my practice is diabetes related, children, adults, and all the different types.
If I may ask, or if you could explore where your interest in diabetes came from and how your experience up to now, maybe your journey in medicine, has led you to what you're focused on today.
So at medical school, they don't teach you much about diabetes. And if anything, I was quite nervous of the condition, particularly of the diabetes emergencies. Yeah, so then I did a diploma in ophthalmology, and for the first time actually understood a lot about diabetes, because there's so much ophthalmology linked to diabetes, the complications of diabetes being eye disease. And once I'd understood it, I'd lost the fear. When I went into private practice, I joined Russell Kirkby, who was doing a lot of diabetes, and encouraged me to do the diploma in diabetes. And yeah, I mean, I kind of almost naturally fell into it, but a lot of the skills that I'd learned along the way have helped me for it to be a fun and happy experience. Whereas I think some practitioners find it dull and boring and they get quite frustrated. Yeah. Whereas for me, it's a joy.
That is quite a contrast. Why do you think that is? That sometimes some people might find it boring, but whereas you found the opposite outlook.
I still actually ask myself that every day, because it's what makes me quite busy. So in a way, I'm grateful. The stories that patients tell me over and over is that they don't feel heard often, that they feel quite lonely, and that they generally, like I've had a spate of type 1 children that have come who have spent a month in hospital, a month out of hospital, pretty much since diagnosis. And these are children who are meant to be in school. At the very end of the first consult, everybody's in tears. And it's largely because no one's actually ever sat with them like that and got the emotional side of it, as well as what they found to be boundaries, as well as explaining exactly how does the medicine work? Why are you testing your sugar? What is our aim here? No one's actually ever done that with them. I'm flabbergasted, but it is what it is. So I work with that. And so for me, it's a joy, because I feel like I'm able to help people. Like all of these kids have now not gone back to hospital. I mean, that's a huge win. And it's really not that I've changed much other than their understanding and their parents' understanding through very basic, I'd call it listening for the most part, and then trying to see where they're at and where their gaps are in their knowledge, and then just gently filling those gaps.
What strikes me most about what you've just described, it seems to me that you are clearly a born empath, and it seems like you're able to put yourself in the shoes of your patients, whereas you'd think that's come standard with all doctors, but it's not necessarily the case. So they talk about bedside manner and they talk about empathy. Where do you think that came from for you? Because clearly that's very distinct for me, that you actually have a really good listening ear and empathy ability.
So I think I was born an empath. I grew up in a very conservative town in South Africa and felt very misunderstood for a very long time. And even went to varsity, first language English, but studied in Afrikaans. Felt very misunderstood. Obviously had a few good friends. So I think it's my own kind of journey that's allowed me to actually develop even more empathy in a way, I think.
I mean, that makes so much sense because you're able to relate to someone who feels those emotions because you felt them yourself.
Yeah.
So tell us a bit more about the state of healthcare today. In my previous interview, I was speaking to someone who mentioned the concerns around the NHI looming, the uncertainties around that. We can talk about diabetes a bit more. Some of the things we've already shared, offline about the injustice and the motivations behind, money rather than people's actual well-being. Maybe you could just sketch the landscape of healthcare, maybe as with diabetes as the focus. That would be great.
So I think in this country, if you are privileged to be on a medical aid, even if it's a low medical aid, you're very lucky. Probably, I want to say 80% of our people living with diabetes find themselves in the state sector. Now, if you have type 1 and you're a child in the state sector, it's actually really difficult to access care. Once you've accessed care, that care is generally of quite a high standard in terms of, like if I think about Grays, which is close to me, they have a very good team, a dedicated team that's doing their absolute best. But for example, they don't have access to testing strips. Now, in a disease like type 1 diabetes, if you only have one strip a day or you have no strips a day, you're dead in the water. I mean, you cannot manage type 1 without sugar readings.
You're basically blind. You need that data. It's foundational.
And I mean, it's even more disempowering for those health practitioners who they know that they're doing their best, but their hands are cut off. Like literally cut off. So in terms of the care, especially because type 1 is such an intense disease, like without your insulin, you die. Before 1920, if you developed type 1 diabetes, you died. Simple as that. And because in order to inject the right amount of insulin, you do need the sugar reading. You can do it blind, and that's what's happening. But you're just not going to get the good results. And you're going to have a sugar that does this, which is bad for your eyes and your kidneys and your brain and everything. So the landscape is very vast and very varied because it really depends where you find yourself. If you find yourself as a type 1 child, for example, in a very rural area, your chances of actually dying of diabetes in this country are quite high. We don't even have the stats on that. We have very few true stats around diabetes in the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, probably in the whole of Africa. And there's a brand new first study being launched in South Africa now, done by the University of Pretoria around type 1. But up to now, the data in our country just hasn't been collected. So we don't even really know what we're dealing with. I can talk anecdotally of children that I've met from very rural areas who have died. And 2025, that shouldn't really happen. So there's all the way from that, all the way right up to private healthcare, top 2 medical aids, children on hybrid closed loop pumps with continuous glucose monitoring, S2 healthcare practitioners pretty much 24/7, and support groups and. And I think the challenge is to try and find more equity in the sub-Saharan African space. And I 100% believe it's possible with not that much money, because we've got so many willing practitioners who are willing to dedicate their time for free even, but there's no coherent effort, so to speak.
So perhaps most of our audience might be in the medical profession or in some way or form connected to healthcare. But perhaps for the broader audience, and even potentially those in the healthcare space but not specifically focused on diabetes, could you explain to us what diabetes essentially is? And I know there are at least 2 types, type 1 and type 2. Maybe you could just unpack that and explain it in plain language what it comes down to and what the impact is on the body. And perhaps you could tell us a bit more about the causes of that, if you could venture a guess.
So in my ideal world, we wouldn't have a classification of type 1 and type 2, and we are now up to type 5 on an international classification. I prefer to look at it on like a spectrum, okay? So your pancreas is an organ that sits in the middle of your body, in the middle from front to back, in the middle from top to bottom. And your pancreas has these cells called beta cells that produce insulin. And every single cell in your body, your brain, your heart, every single cell needs glucose to function. And the insulin is like the key to get the glucose into the cell. So type 2 diabetes, you're starting on a spectrum here, and you've lost some of your beta cells. Generally, the diagnosis is made when you've lost half your beta cells. So type 2 diabetes, we say lifestyle related, but one of the independent risk factors are even age. So age above the age of 40 is an independent risk factor. In other words, that means if you've done everything else right, but you turned 40, you lost half your beta cells, you've got type 2 diabetes. So it's like a part in a car, right? It's worked, and then now it's at half its capacity, and you've got type 2 diabetes. You haven't necessarily even done anything wrong. It's a little bit unfair, but what's even more unfair is if you're a child and you get a virus, or we're not sure what causes it, we think it's a virus, and it wipes out the whole pancreas. So now you have no insulin. Without insulin, you die. You are now dependent on insulin to live. It's this whole scheme of various grades of losing pancreas function. It's definitely not as simple as type 1 and type 2.
I understand there's the core issue, either obviously in terms of you explained the pancreas and its ability to create insulin. Is that correct? Whereas there's also the other side of it where insulin is being resisted by the body and the cells, where there might be insulin, but it's also being resisted for various health factors. Could you speak to the two differences, or maybe, again, it might be a spectrum? Just unpack that a little bit for us mortals.
So I like to explain it like this. Unfortunately, the South African diet, we eat carbs for breakfast, lunch, and supper. And somewhere along the line, this very strange notion came that cornflakes and orange juice is good, that bread for lunch is good, and that pasta and rice and potatoes and meat and veggies kind of an afterthought. What that means is you're loading carb for breakfast, carb for lunch, carb for supper. And every time you do that, your beta cells in your pancreas have to produce insulin to mop up all of that glucose. So if you flog a donkey, it eventually goes, okay, have mercy, enough. Okay, so the insulin resistance is a bit of a twofold thing. Okay, so what happens when we overeat is that we get fat. That fat, especially if you have fat around your stomach, becomes its own organ as such. That contributes to insulin resistance. So what that means is that the insulin that's trying to get the glucose into the cell isn't as effective as it would be in a person who wasn't overweight, and the other thing is something like exercise is the most brilliant way to help your insulin to be more sensitive. So movement, none of us move enough. And it doesn't have to be that you run the comrades, but you do have to move, and you have to move your whole body. So while I think weightlifting is great, it's great for certain muscles and certain things, but there are certain parts of your body that aren't moving. So for me, I'm a big fan of yoga. And I just think it's brilliant because it moves every part of your body. And it's not just physical, it's also getting you to a calm place. And I think there's a lot of value in trying to find that balance, which we've lost as a society. So we want to eat carbs every single meal. We want to almost not do exercise. We are loaded with stress. If you add alcohol into that mix and I've just seen the most crazy amounts of people who drink energy drinks, and they'll drink 5 energy drinks a day. If you add all of that into the whole metabolism of the glucose getting into the cell and all of the subtleties around that, it's just a disaster.
It almost seems like the pancreas and the body and the cells don't have a fighting chance or a fair chance because of just lifestyle choices, ignorance, and a perfect storm of things. So, I mean, obviously this is important, diet and exercise. How ignorant are people in this age of information and YouTube videos on every kind of nutrition and exercise you can do? How is it that people are still so ignorant? Are they willfully ignorant, or what do you ascribe this almost like it's a pandemic in its own?
It's a pandemic in its own. There's definitely an element of willful ignorance because people want to eat what they want to eat and carbs taste nicer in their mind. Yeah, I blame governments as well. This thing's come a long time. So there's a lot of commercial interest in people eating carbs. There are a lot of people who are very wealthy all over the world from that industry, and what's called the healthcare industry, which I'm not convinced that they have people's best interest at heart. It's almost like we're very happy to make people sick, and then so you've got all these supposed cures and fancy things that we can sell you, as opposed to waking people up to the understanding of what even 100 years ago was fairly common knowledge. Eating lots of veggies, doing it like something simple like gardening, growing food, understanding what something like rosemary does. Most people will think that's bizarre. Like, what are you on about? But actually, like, there's so much beautiful free stuff that we don't see anymore. It's not on our radar. We reach for a Monster or a Red Bull when you actually should be going to look at the weed that's growing in your garden to give you micronutrients, give you as much micronutrients as those expensive little green things that you buy from the shop, you know. But we're not, once again, I think there's a range of, unfortunately, like, I don't watch much TV, but when you do, there's this onslaught of things that are advertised to you that you think you then need, but nobody's teaching the slow way of life, the ancient wisdom, which essentially is free, which is why it's not being punted.
There's not the incentive, the economic incentive to distribute that information, because it actually upends the whole system and the incentives that are in place. I mean, if you think about the biggest, I won't name any names, but the biggest companies in the world at the moment, one of the biggest ones in terms of consumer goods would be a sugary drinks company, and then obviously a snack company that also has sugary drinks that aren't quite as popular. But yeah, it's pretty ridiculous. But at the same time, yeah, I mean, if you can't drive down the road in the morning, on the school run without seeing at least 5 or 6 people walking with an energy drink, a specific brand that I keep seeing, and the score, it's just horrible to see. And those people typically then end up with diabetes, and then they don't know why. How did this happen? So it really is a travesty.
It's a travesty. And what upsets me is that our government has so much power to change it, especially at rural levels. I mean, if you go to any rural school, you'll see what's being sold are the cheapest of the cheap sugars, like little lollipops and those awful no nutrition chips. And that is what our children are being fed. And the government knows this. It's like there's so many simple, cheap fixes, but nothing's happened. I know people who sit on government committees who know the numbers. They know the complications of diabetes, how much it's going to cost. I mean, just the diabetes pandemic alone, to me, makes NHI a non-starter. Like, forget it. They don't have that amount of money. They seem to be intent on rolling it out. So let's see. I don't know how this is going to play out. But if you just consider the cost of diabetes to the NHI, crazy amount of money. And yet, there's a million things we can do today to start slowing that trajectory, but we're not.
So I guess the question is then, Dr. Lee, what does the future look like? The direction, the trajectory that you mentioned that we're going into now, how does that look? It sounds pretty bleak, because it does seem like insulin resistance is on the rise, diabetes is definitely on the rise, and yet the means to counter that is just not sufficient. It's like this wave is just coming, and there's nothing to stop it. So on the one hand, how do you see the future? I mean, obviously, you're a more positive and optimistic person, and you're trying to do your bit of, difference that you can make in your sphere. What does the future look like for South Africa or the world potentially? And then what will it take to not have that? Because it's a bleak future. What would it take to turn that around?
Honestly, I don't think it takes a lot. I think it's and I see this in my daily practice. So if I think about those kids who've spent so much time in hospital, what did it take? It took one consult. It took listening. It took understanding. And it took a little bit of education, because obviously how much education can I really give in an hour? Not much. That kind of needs to be more ongoing. But if we could just start with small basics like that, but distributing it in a way that's palatable to people, because often I'll do a talk, even to a school or a group of people, and they just shut down. Why? Because, I don't know.
A dopamine release or something, yeah. You're competing against TikTok. You have
spent a lot of time in hospital to have the ears open that you also as a patient want to listen. Like, how is it that we try and find that key to unlock, and I think mothers generally want to feed their children healthy food. Is that a good place to start? I don't know. We've got to try and find a key to gently start getting the message, so that people understand. And So I sell books in my practice. Sometimes I give them away because then people say they can't afford them. But there's actually so much out there that you can do not expensively. I mean, honestly, the food that I recommend is cheaper than the cornflakes and the orange juice. It's on par with a slice of bread. I'm not saying to people you need to eat salmon.
Yeah.
Oh, there are ways and means of doing it. I think the challenge is, how do we get a coherent group of people to actually have a big impact, an impact enough that actually can filter down to rural families in this country?
Yeah. No, I mean, it does seem like one almost needs to hit that wall forcibly and then have a health scare and then realize, but perhaps it's almost too late, or I shouldn't have done that. And up until that point, it's like I'm eating these cheap chips, I'm drinking this energy drink, nothing's happening, I'm fine. But it all builds up, doesn't it? And eventually you can't see what's happening in your body. So we need to make that obvious somehow, the damage.
So the sad thing is that it takes 20 to 30 years to have a heart attack. It takes 20 to 30 years to develop type 2 diabetes. It doesn't happen overnight. And for all of that time, and for argument's sake, for high blood pressure as well, for all of that time, you are asymptomatic, but it's day after day after day of abuse. And to me, the human body is amazing because it can take that much abuse. I mean, I had a lady, an 81-year-old lady the other day who has just become diabetic. And she told me that for her whole life, 81 years, she's been eating packets of sweets every day. And I'm like, how amazing is the human body that you're 81? You've done fantastically. Actually,
What's the odds?
So there's genetics as well. Hey, if you get good genes, you're lucky. You can eat sweets every day and only develop it at 81.
It buys you a bit more time.
I think what people generally don't realize is they do have this notion that they're bulletproof until the moment they're not bulletproof. At 81, she was horrified, mortified. Like, to her, that's the end of the world. You're beautiful. You're 81. You're like, and this disease, we can help. Like, you can live to 181. Like, if you control your sugar, that's not a limiting thing.
I'm wondering, since we're on the conversation and since this may be an opportunity that someone could see this, is there some wisdom you could dispense in terms of choices, like typical choices that you'd see and then you'd say, replace it with this? Are there some examples like that off the top of your head that you would like to share at this point?
So for me, I'm that, and they call it the diet wars, right? Because you've got keto and you've got intermittent fasting, and there's a million different diets and diet wars. I'm more old school in terms of, I think breakfast is an important meal to have. So I recommend a savory breakfast. So whether that's eggs and whatever form of salad that you can tolerate in the morning, because that's the other thing, some people can't tolerate it, whether it's full cream, the Greek yogurt, so in other words, no sugar added, because in yogurt there's already lactose, but the yogurt's also got fat, so that then helps to keep the sugar more stable. So switching out, most people eat breakfast cereal for breakfast, and it's loaded with sugar. So it's a carb plus added sugar. So it really is poison. A lot of people think that fruit juice is good for you, and fruit juice can be good for you. Like, there are certain things like vitamin C and stuff in it, but generally fruit is better eaten as a whole fruit because then you're getting the fiber with the fruit. Whereas when you're drinking just a fruit juice, it's almost as densely packed with glucose. It's just natural glucose, but it's the same thing as a Coke. So if we can just make that mind shift of having a savory breakfast, preferably without the toast. But then there are ranges of things like low carb, and they make a range of bread. It's expensive, but it's also lower in carbs. So if you can try and just concentrate on getting less carbs in, that already makes a huge difference.
Yeah.
That's an easy sort of switch to make.
Why is it that we love carbs so much, though? I guess I even struggle with that. I mean, many people do.
We all do. So carbs are quick, and sugar makes you feel good. Salad doesn't necessarily make you feel good in the moment, but it does make you feel good long term, and it does help you have energy long term. Thing with a sugar spike is it spikes you and it dips you. So the carbs are great for that spike, but you've still got to live with the rest of it. Also, carbs are crunchy. And we as humans like that crunchy, it's a texture thing. So, for example, you can make wraps with a piece of lettuce. which is much more healthy and not expensive, and is also crunchy. And I think that's the other thing, is a lot of people won't persist with eating a lot of veggies and healthy food for long enough to actually feel the effect of how good they actually feel in a more broader spectrum. They kind of give up too soon and they go back to what they know, which is bread. I mean, we all eat a lot of bread, and because it's cheap, it's easy. We like the way it tastes. We like how we feel when we eat a piece of bread. So it is a very difficult mind shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so true what you say. If someone could just have the experience of perhaps being on this, taking these nutritional choices seriously, making good choices, and really getting to feel they probably never felt, those benefits in their entire life. Once they can get the taste of that, perhaps then they'll be like, okay, I'm not turning back. But until then, they'll go with the devil they know. And I mean, what is more delicious than a donut, for example? I mean, it's crazy, but that's like the worst thing you can probably eat. Pasta, bread.
So I also believe that what we eat and the food we eat and how we live life, like a lot of our quality of our life comes from our food. So celebrations around food. When you travel, one of the things that makes travel so beautiful is the food you eat. So I think it also doesn't help to demonize the carbs, because there are clever ways. So like, I love the glucose goddess. I don't know if you've heard of her. So she's got these beautiful tips where you eat your salad first, then your protein, and your carbs last. And then instead of having the spike, you have a much more gradual curve. Then there are clever carbs. So something like quinoa, bulgur wheat, brown rice to a degree is a little bit better, and then also portion size. So obviously, if you have 7 roast potatoes, 2 cups of rice, and a slice of bread, and a lot of people do that, and they're so used to it. But if we could just choose one carb and have half the portion we normally would have had, that's still healthy. I think it's these nuances as well.
Yeah.
Because how do you communicate this to people so that they understand it? And there's so much. And like I say, when there's the diet wars, like, people will listen to a podcast and they get so confused. What's the truth? What's right? And then each person is an individual. So there is a beautiful diet for each individual that doesn't look like the next person's diet. So it does.
A little bit tricky, hey? Yeah.